Sharks, today we're going to discuss how to bluff like a pro on the river. Because that's important. A lot of people blunder on the river, left and right. And I want to be sure that you all do not blunder on the river, left and right, because if you do, you're going to lose a ton of money. My computer is not functioning properly, so if you all can tell that I'm here, please let me know. We do this show live on Monday mornings, 9 a.m. Eastern time, whenever I am at home. I'll be home some, I'll be away some. I have a hectic schedule coming out soon. I think I will actually be home. Most Mondays, though, until late November. So we have a little brain fuels lined up. Make sure you check out brainfuel.com. They power me in the mornings. They let me get a lot of work done for all of you. You can use code, Poker Coaching. Get a little discount. Bluff like Adamo. Adamo certainly does bluff his little rumpus off. So, we're going to go through part of my cash game masterclass. This is part of pokercoaching.com. You can check it out at pokercoaching.com, and you can test yourself at pokercoaching.com/bluffing quiz as soon as we are done here. In order to figure out how you should go about bluffing, though, you need to understand what your overall range looks like in various scenarios, because it's not as easy as, can you win at the showdown? If you can't, you should bluff. Because quite often, your bluffs are going to fail, right? You want to make sure you're bluffing in spots that make logical sense. You have to understand that on the river, you no longer have draws or semi-bluffs, right? You either have hands that are almost always good or almost always not good. And then you have some hands in the middle, right? You have to understand, a value bet is essentially betting when you expect to win at the showdown when called more than half the time. Now, that definition is actually kind of loose, especially when you are out of position, but essentially that's what a value bet is. A bluff is when you expect to lose at the showdown when you're called 100% of the time. And you have to realize the goal of value betting is to extract maximum value from worst possible hands as often as possible. And the goal of bluffing is to force hands to fold that are better than yours and to get your opponents to call when you have a value hand. Because if you only bet with value hands on the river, then your opponent can just fold, right? So essentially, bluffing allows you to get extra value from your value hands. So when you are faced with a decision of whether or not to bet on the river, you need to ask yourself these roughly 8 questions, okay? First, you want to analyze your range. How many bet sizes should you be using in this spot for value? Because sometimes it's very few, sometimes it's a decent number. Next, what sizes should they be? Next, how should I structure these ranges? We're going to discuss that today. Also, what percentage of bluffs do you need to have for each size? And yes, you should have bluffs in all of your bet sizes. What a lot of people do wrong is they will, let's say, use a tiny bet size on the river and a big bet size on the river, but they'll only bluff in the big bet size, which means their tiny bet size is 100% for value. Well, that's obviously a problem, right? Because if your tiny bet size is 100% for value, your opponents can just do a lot of folding, right? Now, of course, your tiny bet size may be for thin value, and then your opponents can do a lot of raising and put you in really rough spots. So you want to make sure that you do include some nuts and some bluffs in all your betting ranges. And if you look at GTO strategies, that is what it does. Good morning, everyone. I see everyone trickling in. We're just getting started. Hello, good morning. If you like this show, do me a favor, click the like button. I know this is not a scandalous show like are people cheating in poker. I still don't know. But I like poker education, believe it or not. Hopefully all of you like this as well. Click the like button, click the subscribe button. I would appreciate it. Next, how does the river card impact your range/equity? Meaning, how does it change your opponent's equity compared to your equity? If your equity goes up, you usually bet more often because you have stronger hands in general, right? So once you've gone through those first 5 questions, next you want to analyze your exact hand. Okay, should you bet or check with this exact hand? Where does this hand fall in your range, essentially? Next, if you bet for value, which size should you use? And if you bet as a bluff, why are you choosing this particular hand to bluff? That's important because sometimes you should be bluffing with stuff like bottom pair, and sometimes you should be bluffing with stuff like the nut low. And it depends on primarily how your blockers line up with your opponent's range. So let's first discuss analyzing your range. On the river, you pretty much always want to have 2 bet sizes unless you are very shallow stacked. Okay? Now, from a GTO point of view, you want to have a ton of bet sizes. But for an implementable point of view, yeah, you could just have 1, but you're going to find that in most scenarios, you want to have at least 2. And as you get better and better at poker, you want to have more and more and more. For example, from out of position, in some spots, you want to have a really tiny bet, a half pot bet, a full size pot bet, and an all-in bet for a particular scenario. Now, figuring out how to structure your ranges for all those spots and put bluffs and value bets in each of them is very, very daunting, right? And you will definitively lose some amount of EV by using only, let's say, a minimum bet and a pot size bet. But that's going to be way easier to implement than using all sorts of bet sizes. But if your options are only 1 bet size, well, then you're going to leave a lot of money on the table. Because if you, let's say, only potted on the river, there's a whole lot of hands that want to bet minimum. And if you only bet minimum, well, there's a whole lot of hands that want to bet pot. So you're going to find that you usually want to have at least 2 distinct sizes. And for simplicity, that's probably what you do want to use. So this allows you to extract maximum value with hands that are way ahead. And it also allows you to extract some value with hands that are slightly ahead. And in general, the larger the bet size you use, that's usually where you want to be using your premium hands. So when you bet bigger, you want to have most of your really, really good made hands. And when you bet smaller, you usually want to have your good but okay marginal hands. And you're going to balance this by including some bluffs and traps in each range. You want to make sure you're including some traps. Traps means like super nuts and you're never folding. Because when you, let's say, bet small and get raised, you want to make sure you have a lot of auto calls in that scenario. Okay, next, what size should your bets be? Typically, your small size is something like 10% to 50% pot. Typically, your large size is going to be very polarized, meaning you have either really good hands or really junky hands. And usually that's going to be something like 2/3 pot to gigantic, 500% pot, huge bets. So why is the large size so large? Well, the GTO strategy is to bet the maximum amount with the nuts. When you have the best hand, you want to put all your money in. Common sense, right? So if you want to put all your money with the nuts, well, you can also mix in some bluffs. And if you are perfectly polarized against your opponent, where either you have hands that always win when they call or always lose when they call, if you are perfectly polarized, you win whatever is in the pot on average, which is very, very, very powerful. Winning the pot on average every time is excellent. And being perfectly polarized allows for that. So you're going to find that with the nuts, you want to be blasting it, and you want to make sure you mix in some bluffs appropriately. So let's make something clear here, right? When you're betting polarized, very rarely are you perfectly polarized. Perfectly polarized, or having perfect polarization, is when you're betting the maximum amount possible of both the nut low and the nut high, okay? This presumes your value bets always win and your bluffs always lose, right? And this puts your opponent in a position where they are indifferent. The problem, though, is that very often you're not perfectly polarized against a good player, because good players will have some super nuts in their range as well. In most scenarios. Not all scenarios, but in most scenarios. And if they have some super nuts in their range, your second nuts are not actually the super nuts, right? So let's say you bet on the river for a pot-sized bet with a perfectly polarized range. Okay? In this scenario, your range will have 67% value hands and 33% bluffs, which makes sense because you're betting pot. There's a pot in the pot, and your opponent has to put a pot-sized bet in. 1, 2, 3. That means you want to have 2/3 value, 1/3 bluff. Okay? So you want to have 2/3 value, 1/3 bluff, because that's the pot odds you're giving your opponent, right? They need to win 33% of the time to call, and they are going to win 33% of the time, right? Which results in a 0 EV call. So the best they can do now is not lose money. Now, if you have more than a pot-sized bet, you can use different sizes. If you have less than a pot-sized bet, well, you get to have fewer bluffs because your opponent's getting better odds, right? So how should we go about structuring this range? Well, imagine your entire range of hands that you could have are classified into 4 categories of equity. We have our total junk, our no showdown value hands. We have our some showdown value hands like ace high, bottom pair, etc. We have our thin value hands like middle pair. And then we have our value hands like flushes and sets and straights and stuff like that. Hands that are almost always good. Okay? Your best hands, your premium hands, will usually want to bet large. Obviously, you're going to have to mix some of those into your various other bet sizes, but usually the super nuts want to bet large. Next, the marginal hands usually want to bet small. The some showdown hands occasionally win whenever it goes check-check, depending on the exact scenario. Sometimes top pair may be a hand that's a some showdown value hand that doesn't want to bet on, let's say, a 4 straight board or something like that, right? So it's not like ace high is always a hand that wants to check. It's more like hands that win some amount of the time at the showdown that also cannot bet and then expect to get called by worse hand more than 50% of the time want to check. And then your no showdown hands basically always lose, right? So let's take a look at an example. Suppose you raise the 3 big blinds from the button and get a caller from the big blind. You see about a 33% pot on ace 7-6. Turn goes check, check, and the big blind checks you on the river. How would you classify the following hands on ace 7-6, jack, jack? You see the hands here? If you're listening to the audio of this, well, you're missing out. You should definitely be watching this. You can find this on youtube.com/pokercoaching. Ace 2 is a thin value hand because you could easily be running into a jack, you could easily be running into a better ace, but this is a hand that's very likely good and probably should bet for value. Jack 10 is obviously super nuts. When you river trips, you want to bet. 10-8 is obviously nothing, no showdown value. And in this scenario, 7-6. What is 7-6? 7-6 is jack, jack, 7-7, ace. So not a particularly great hand. It was a good hand until the river. That is a some showdown value hand that probably does not want to bet. And you want to go through and think about how all these hands in your range will play. And logically, in this scenario, you're going to want to be betting very big with your premium made hands like jacks for trips and some of your no showdown value hands. Now, this might actually not be that great of a no showdown value hand to bet because it blocks your opponent from having some auto folds with busted flush draws, right? Whenever you have 10-8 of diamonds on ace 7-6, jack, jack, 2 diamonds, the 10 and the 8 of diamonds are particularly bad cards to have in your hand because it makes it more likely your opponent does not have a flush draw, which makes it more likely they have a pair, right? Obaka says, you find that when you overbet on the river, 2x pot, for example, when your opponent clearly has a marginal hand, you win the pot almost always. So look, this is where you have to ask, am I trying to maximally exploit my opponent or am I trying to develop good, strong GTO strategies, right? We're discussing here, roughly, GTO strategies. If you know something your opponent does wrong, take advantage of it, right? Like, let's say, in this scenario, you continuation bet the flop, your opponent calls, turn goes check, check, river, they check again. If you're in that spot, and you know for a fact that your opponent has worse than an ace, and you know they'll always fold, let's say, a 2x pot size bet, well, then blast it, and you win the pot every time. Life's easy, right? If your opponents are not going to protect their range as well, then all you have to do is maximally exploit them. But good players, I can guarantee you on this river, are going to check with some aces that are never folding, and they're going to check with some jacks that are never folding. Which is where you have to be very careful, realizing that even a hand like Jack 10 is not part of a perfectly polarized range, or Ace King is not part of a perfectly polarized range. To be fair, you probably bet Ace King on the turn, but if you did have Ace King, that's a hand that's like, it's certainly a premium made hand, but it's also not perfectly polarized because it very easily could be beat if your opponent's good. But if your opponent would always bet with a jack on the river, and always bet with an ace on the river, as a lot of bad players do, well then, yeah, you can just blast it and win the pot every time. When your opponents play poorly, life becomes very, very easy. All right, so let's discuss structuring our 3 value ranges. We have our premium hands, our thin value hands, and then our, some showdown hands, okay? So let's discuss betting large. When you're betting large, you want to have a lot of premium hands and then some bluffs, right? When you bet small, you want to have a lot of thin value hands, some super nuts, and some bluffs. And when you check from out of position, you're going to find that you want to have a mixture of your worst hands and some showdown value hands, and a tiny bit of nuts. Remember how I just said, if your opponent always bets with their jacks and tens on that, or jacks and aces on that previous hand, meaning they have worse than top pair, they're super easy to play against. But if they're good, they're going to be checking with some super nuts. They can check raise you and put you in a miserable spot, right? And they'll also be checking with some hands like, pairs and they can reasonably call, like an ace, right? So the larger the bet size you use, the more bluffs you get to have, because the worse pot odds your opponent is getting. When you use your tiny bet size, you're going to want to bluff infrequently, depending on how tiny you're actually betting. For example, if you're betting 1 big blind into a 10 big blind pot, you don't get to bluff very often at all. You should bluff sometimes, though. And when you bet minimum 1 big blind into a 10 big blind pot, you also get to have some nuts in your range. You need to have some nuts in your range, especially if your opponents are going to attack your minimum bet range. As you bet bigger and bigger, you should actually bluff more frequently, which may be counterintuitive to some people because they think I'm risking more money, therefore I should have fewer bluffs. But that is not true. As you're risking more money, your opponent's getting worse pot odds, and as long as you are perfectly polarized or getting closer and closer to being perfectly polarized, then you get to have more and more bluffs, right? And the difficult thing here is to try to figure out which hands you should actually bluff with, because like I just said a minute ago, that 10-8 of diamonds for almost a nut low may actually be a pretty bad hand to bluff in that scenario. You may decide that a hand like a 6 for bottom pair may be a better hand to bluff because that blocks some of your opponent's auto calls with full houses and hands like a6 and whatnot. So it's difficult to figure out which hands your bluff should actually come from, but we're going to be discussing how to roughly do that in a little bit. Next, what percentage of bluffs do you need to have? Recall, the larger the bet size you use, the more bluffs you get to have. And the maximum bluffs you can ever have gets closer and closer to 50% as your bet size becomes infinite. Infinite. So if the pot's 1 big blind and you bet $1 million, if the pot's $1 and you bet $1 million, you get to have whatever it is. You get to have 50.0001% nuts and 49.999% bluffs. And you'll win that dollar pot on average. Is it worth it? I'm not so sure about that. But in that scenario, you're essentially putting your opponent in a roughly 50-50 spot, and you know that you're getting a little bit of an edge because there's that extra dollar in the pot, right? So you get to blast them in that scenario. This is something you see a lot of the best cash game players do. You see this a lot in heads up, no limit hold'em, especially. And that's something that a lot of people just do not do. They never overbet the pot. They think the biggest bet they can possibly make is 1.5x pot. They think, oh my God, that's giant. But if you think about it, it's not actually all that big, right? Let's take a look at this formula here. The formula, the percent of bluffs you can have in your range, is the amount your opponent needs to call divided by the pot they could win, the total pot they could win. Okay? Let's take a look at an example. On the river, you bet 33 big blinds into a 100 big blind pot. What percentage of bluffs should you have? Take a second, do the math. Well, it's 33 divided by 100, which is the pot, plus 33, which is your 33, plus your opponent's 33, which means you get to have about 19.8% bluffs in this scenario. So you should structure your range such that your betting range is about 80% value, 20% bluffs. Imagine instead we were betting 150 big blinds here, right? For 1.5% or 1.5x pot. Let's get our handy dandy calculator. We would then have, where do I put this? We would then have 150 divided by how much? 100 plus 150 plus 150. 150 divided by 400 equals 37.5% bluffs. Did I do that right? 150 plus 150, 300 plus 4. Yeah, okay. So, in that spot, you actually don't even get to bluff all that often, only 37.5% of the time. Okay? Okay. So anyway, this is how you figure out what percentage of bluffs you should have in your range. Now, slow down. That's actually not the correct answer. We're going to figure out how to find closer to the correct answer in a minute. So, as you bet bigger and bigger, you can have more and more and more and more bluffs. So with a 300% pot size bet, you can have 43% bluffs. This is just going through this math here, right? 2x over pot, you can have 40% bluffs. We just saw 150% pot, you can have 37% bluffs. Pot size bet, you can have 33% bluffs. 50% pot, 25% bluffs. Third pot, 20% bluffs. And this is usually how you're going to go about constructing your range. As you're betting bigger and bigger, you're not going to be betting your thinnish value hands, these hands in blue. Okay? And you're going to be betting more and more just premium hands. Typically, as you're betting pot size or bigger, usually you're going to have like a pretty polarized range. Okay? As you're betting pot or bigger, it's going to become pretty polarized. As you're betting smaller, you'll have some super nuts, mostly marginal made hands, and a little bit of bluffs. You want to do a little bit more math? I'll do some more math while I answer some questions in the chat. Do you suggest being polarized at all times on the river in small stakes games? No. In small stakes games, you should very often thin value bet because a lot of people don't raise nearly often enough. You can value bet thinner way more often if your opponents will basically never raise you. You consider tax liabilities like a rake. I don't know. I just pay them. I pay. I changed your game completely. Glad to hear it. Skate Tyler, hope you're enjoying the show. Hope you're all having a great day. Micah says you enjoyed mastering small stakes no limit hold'em. Great. I'm glad to hear it. You played a tournament recently. Pros bought in a couple levels before late registration. Why? I don't know. I think a lot of quote-unquote pros don't realize where a lot of their edge comes from, or they highly value their time away from the poker table. Because whenever you show up early in a tournament, let's say 200 big blinds deep, you don't actually win that much in terms of dollars per hour, right? You win a lot in terms of big blinds per hour. You may win 10 or 15 or 20 big blinds per hour, which is a great win rate, but that's only 1/20th of a starting stack. So if you're playing a $1,000 tournament and you win a 20th of a starting stack, that's $50 per hour on average, which is not that much for a lot of pros. And if a lot of pros are going to do that, they may not find it worth their time. That said, they show up late and they expect to win, let's say, 4 big blinds per hour, but 4 big blinds per hour may be a third of a stack, right? A third of a stack is $333 in an hour. They go there, they show up, they shoot it in. To be fair, it's probably bad math because they're not going to win 33% ROI. But usually you'll have a pretty high hourly rate right at the end of the late registration period. And also that's where a lot of players make big mistakes. And all you got to do is like win a flip or two and you get in the money quite often. Then you can try to spin it up. That said, you're allowed to show up on time and buy in late. Is this live? You're seeing it on about a 10-second delay. That's just how the program works. Using the rule of 2 and 4 determines outs. Be very careful with calling anything a rule that's not accurate. Seems to be that off from the actual percentages. Yes, it is. How do you convert outs to equity percentage? You divide the number of outs you have by the amount of cards remaining that are unseen. You're going to launch a poker, I guess, game on Cardano in a few weeks. Well, good luck. Have fun. I have an NFT project called Deck of Degeneracy. Check it out if you have not already. We have physical decks of cards. Here they are. Physical decks of cards. If you have a Deck of Degeneracy NFT, you can request a physical deck of cards we mail to you. We do giveaways all the time. I give away percentage of my poker action. So far, I've given away about $400,000 in ETH to my holders over the last 8 months. Also, we give away a ton of art. I love art. Check it out, deckofdegeneracy.com. I do a lot of stuff. That's a passion project, though. I give away a bunch of money. I don't know very many NFT projects that have given back all the money they brought in except for mine, but I do mine for fun. Is King 5 suited a polarized range? No. That's one hand. In order to be a range, you have to have many hands in a range. All right, let's do some quick math. 75% pot. 75 divided by 100 plus 75 plus 75 equals 30% bluffs. What about this 500% pot over bet? Does anybody know? It's going to be 500 divided by 100 plus 500 plus 500, right? Which is 45% bluffs. Whenever you bet 5x pot, you get to have 45% bluffs. Okay. Now, slow down, everybody. The impact of traps on bluffing percentage. Remember I just said good players will trap you some portion of the time, as they should. A trap is a hand in the opponent's range that can beat hands in your polarized value range. And the more traps your opponent has in their range, the fewer bluffs you can have. Because sometimes your value hands lose, right? So these factors will increase the amount of traps your opponent will naturally have in their range. As your opponent has a large nut advantage, meaning their range connects really well with the board where they just have a lot of nuts, like trips or something like that. Let's say you raise under the gun, big blind calls, it comes jack 6-6. In that scenario, they have a lot of sixes and you don't. Therefore, they have a lot of nuts, right? In that scenario, they have a large nut advantage and they will naturally have a bunch of sixes and you will not. Therefore, hands like pocket aces on jack 6-6 can value bet, but they don't always win, right? Next, when your opponent has a large range disadvantage, such as on jack 6-6. On jack 6-6, when you raise under the gun and they call, they cannot do a whole lot of betting because while they do have a lot of nuts, they also have a whole lot of garbage, right? And you have aces, kings, queens, jacks, 10s, 9s, 8s, 7s, ace, jack, king, jack, queen, jack, jack, 10, all these really good hands. So in that scenario, your opponent just does not get to bet all that often because their range is in such bad shape, even though they do have a nut advantage, right? Also, whenever you bet using small sizes, your opponent will naturally have a wider potential range of hands that can beat you, right? Because let's say you're value betting on jack 6-6 with pocket twos, jack 6-6, 4-3, let's say. If you value bet on the river with pocket twos, obviously you could easily be beat, right? And next, if your opponent's just known to slow play, this is a player-specific tendency, you should be more inclined to be a little bit cautious. Okay? So, how does this impact our range construction? You want to bluff less often and check more often, as your opponent's likely to trap more and more often based on these 4 factors. All right? This is definitely going to impact your small bet range more than your big bet range too. Because when you're betting big, you're just naturally polarized. But whenever you bet small, it is more likely that your opponent has a hand that just beats yours, right? Just like, say you're value betting middle pair marginal kicker, they could just easily have top pair that's obviously never folding. Okay. Generally, the more frequently you're betting, the smaller size you use. Good rivers give you a nut advantage, and therefore, you get to increase your bluffing percentage with a large size. Good rivers for you that increase your equity but do not give you the nut advantage will increase your ability to bluff using a small size. Bad rivers that give your opponent more equity force you to check more often, and bad rivers that give your opponent extra nuts force you to bluff less often. So rivers that decrease your range advantage across the board force you to check more often just because your whole range is in bad shape. But bad rivers that give your opponent extra nuts, which decrease your nut advantage, force you to bluff less often. So slightly different things here, right? Your equity goes down, you bet less often. In general, your nut advantage goes down, you bluff less often, although you can still bet a decent amount of the time because you still have a range advantage. Let's go through a few examples. Suppose you raise the 3 big blinds pre-flop from the button with queen, jack of diamonds. Big blind calls. You bet third pot on ace 8-2. Turn goes check, check on a 9. Maybe you want to keep betting. And the big blind checks you on the river. River's a king. How would you classify this king of diamonds? And how does it impact your bluff percentage? What should you do with the queen, jack of diamonds in this spot against a roughly GTO player? In position, you're going to find your big bet size is usually roughly pot or bigger. Your small bet is roughly 50% pot. That's a very common thing, by the way. In position, when you're check to, your smallest bet from a GTO point of view is usually going to be about half pot or perhaps even bigger. If your hand's not good enough to value bet for half pot, you just don't bet it to begin with because when you bet, your opponent can check raise you. And it's a disaster, right? So in this scenario, you're not going to value bet at 2. Let's say you're just going to check with a 2 and hope to win the pot. So in this spot, do we have the range advantage? Probably. Do we have the nut advantage? I think so. Notice in this spot, we definitely have various 2 pairs. We definitely have ace X. That's definitely good enough to go for value a lot of the time. The opponent would often check raise some ace X on the flop and would often bet some ace X on the river. We can probably even value bet a king here. So anyway, I think this is a spot where we probably want to go for a big size. So as we see here, good card, and we have the nut advantage. The king is much better for your range than the big blind. You have all good sets of 2 pairs. If we choose to bluff, we should often bluff using a large size. And notice here, when we get a really, really good river, like this one is, we typically want to bet bigger and bigger and bigger and use perhaps even a few extra bluffs. Okay? What if instead the river was the 8 of diamonds? Same spot. River's the 8 of diamonds instead of the king of diamonds. Interesting scenario. Interesting scenario. Take a second. Think about it. So this card is going to be pretty good for the opponent, right? Now, the question becomes, will they actually check with an 8? Remember I said some people will, some people won't. If your opponent will, as someone mentioned earlier, literally say, my opponent always bets trips on the river, they always bet an ace on the river, therefore they have not many 9s in their range, so they probably have a 2 or just nothing. If that's the case, well, you can probably just blast it and win the pot every time. But if your opponent's good, they're going to have some aces and they're going to have some 8s. Also notice we may not necessarily bet every 8 on the flop, so we don't actually have a lot of 8s. We have some, but not all of them. Okay? So in this scenario, we have a bad river card and traps are more likely. Therefore, we're probably not going to bluff to begin with. But if we do bluff, we're going to need to be very, very polarized, right? If we do decide to bluff, we're going to be very polarized, I think, here. But we're really just not going to be bluffing in this scenario all that often. As you see, we have way fewer than 33% bluffs whenever we are potting it in this spot. Therefore, we're just going to have extra checks in these scenarios. Okay? Now, let's discuss analyzing your exact hand. So far, we've just been talking about our whole range, every hand we could possibly have. Now, remember, we have a few additional questions here. Should I bet or check this exact hand, and should I bet for value? And if so, which side should I use? Is my exact hand one of my best hands that has 65% equity or more when you get called? Essentially, is my opponent likely to have something that could call a large bet? If yes, if they could have a hand that will call a large bet, you usually want to bet large. Although you want to make sure you remember to balance it with small sizes. If no, we'll move on to the next step. Next, is my exact hand one of my thin value hands that has 51% equity or more when I get called? If yes, you should usually bet small. And if no, you do not need, or if no, do you need to bluff to balance your value range? If you do not so much, then you want to be checking. If yes, you want to go to the bluffing decision flowchart. All right, we're going to get to that in just a second. Before we look at this flowchart, though, you need to understand a few key terms. First, auto calls. These are hands that your opponent will call pretty much any bet with. Stuff like top pair on an uncoordinated board, or 3 of a kind, or a straight, right? These are hands people just don't fold. So those are hands that are auto calls. Auto folds are hands that your opponent will fold to any bet. These are going to be unpaired hands on a lot of boards. Obviously, some people just find hero calls all the time for no reason, but auto folds are typically hands like jack high. They will fold to any bet no matter what. They usually don't raise, they usually don't go all in. Next, blockers. Blockers become more and more relevant as they are realistically found in your opponent's range, as they remove combinations of calling hands from your opponent's range, and as the bet size increases. As you're betting bigger and bigger and bigger, blockers become more and more and more and more and more and more relevant. If you have a high rate, but your tax liability is 0, is that bad? You got to be able to beat the game first before taxes become relevant. If you can't beat your game because the rake is too high, then you can't pay any taxes. 0% of 0 is 0. But 50% of $1 million is $500,000. So no, you need to be able to beat your game first. Taxes are a tax on your profits, right? And if you cannot profit in your game, then there are no taxes. Now, of course, if you can profit half of what you could profit in a no-rake game due to high rake, and there's no taxes, then it's effectively the same as somebody who wins at the end of the year and just has to pay half of their money to win first. All right, here's a bluffing decision flowchart. Take a second, screenshot it. If I bet as a bluff, why am I choosing this hand to bluff? Thanks to T-Dubs for 9 months of subscribing on Twitch. That's fun. Did you all know if you are on Twitch and you have an Amazon Prime membership, you can give away a subscription for free to someone. I don't necessarily need it, but a lot of people do. Make sure you take advantage of that every month. Log into your favorite streamer. Give them the Amazon Prime subscription. They get a few dollars. It costs you nothing. Otherwise, Amazon keeps it. All right. here we go. Bluffing decision flowchart. Your betting frequency is determined by these 6 things. Now, perhaps there are a few more things. Perhaps some of these could be combined, etc., but these are things you want to keep in mind. Is my opponent capable of folding? If your opponent's just not going to fold, then you probably don't want to bluff, right? If your opponent will fold a lot, then you want to bluff. What's my Twitch name? Twitch.tv/Jonathan Little, I think. Next, do you lack showdown value? Meaning if it goes check, check, you just cannot win. If you cannot win, you should usually be more inclined to bluff. Do I have a lot of value hands in my range? If you have a lot of value hands in your range, you in turn want to bet more often, which allows you to bluff more often, right? If you don't have many value hands, you don't get to bluff that often. Are my blockers highly relevant? Do you block straights and flushes and whatnot? If you block those hands, then you want to be more inclined to bluff. Do you unblock your opponent's auto folds? Auto folds, remember, are going to be stuff like king high, queen high, jack high, etc. If you have those cards in your hand, it means your opponent likely does not have those cards in their hand. Also, flush card, like say there's a flush draw on the flop and the flush draw bricks off. You don't especially want to have those busted flush draws because those unblock your opponent's auto folds. Go back to that spot where we had, 10-8 of diamonds. I said this might not even be a great hand to bluff because even though it is effectively a hand that lacks showdown value, it also is a big no, a big fat no over here that should tell you to not bluff. So quite often the answers to these questions are going to be contradicting each other, which kind of makes poker difficult, right? Next, does my bluff tell a credible story? Would I actually play value hands in this way? If you're playing it from a GTO point of view, you will be. Okay, so let's say you have mostly yeses or the overriding factor over here, which is, again, sometimes difficult to know which one of these matter more than the others because all these don't matter the same amount in each scenario. If it's mostly yes over here, then you go down here to determine which size you should bluff. So, do we have no showdown value whatsoever? If we have no showdown value whatsoever, you usually want to bet large. Not always, but usually. Not always, but usually. Next, does my opponent have many marginal made hands? Meaning, they lose to all of my nuts. If your opponent has a lot of marginal made hands, you usually want to be betting large. Now, if your opponent either has a lot of really good hands or garbage, in that scenario, you want to be betting small, right? So if your opponent has flushes or nothing, say for some reason you know their range is flush draws and straight draws. Flush draws come in, straight draws miss. In that scenario, they either have super nuts or they have total air, like jack high. Typically, in that scenario, you can bet small and they'll fold their jack high and they will call or raise all their flushes, right? So there's no reason to bet large there, because if you bet large, you're just losing more money than is necessary against their nuts. So you'd rather lose a third pot or half pot than pot, right? Next, do you block a lot of nut hands? As you block more nut hands, you typically want to bet bigger. As you do not block nut hands, you typically want to bet smaller. Next, are you trying to get your opponent to fold a strong hand? If you're trying to get them to fold out top pair or middle pair, you typically want to bet big. If you're trying to get them to fold out bottom pair or jack high, you usually want to be betting small. Next, are you representing a nutted hand? If you're representing a nut hand, you typically want to bet big. If you're representing more of a thin value range, because a lot of your hands are top pair, marginal kicker, or middle pair, then you usually want to be betting small. Greetings from Cyprus. I went to Cyprus a long time ago. I think I took 8th place in a WPT they had there a long time ago. It was a lot of fun. Don't know when I'll be back. It's exactly on the other side of the world from where I live. Turns out it's kind of difficult to get to the exact other side of the world. Probably quicker to go through the middle of the earth. All right, let's take a look at an example. You raise the 3 big blinds pre-flop from the button with queen jack of diamonds. Get a caller from the big blind, who is somewhat of a calling station. You see bet a third pot on 10-9-4, 2 diamonds. Turn goes check, check on a 9, which makes sense. The big blind checks on the river. Use the bluffing decision flowchart to decide if you should bluff or not with our queen high. If your decision is to bluff, use the flowchart to determine the recommended sizing. And again, you can go through this flowchart in every scenario and you're going to get at least a reasonable play. I realize that a lot of this is kind of subjective, right? And sometimes it's not clear what the flowchart's going to necessarily tell you, but if you look at the flowchart and like all the answers are yes, you should bluff, or all the answers are no, you should not bluff, well, you should probably do that, right? So let's take a look at the flowchart. Is your opponent capable of folding? Not especially. Do you lack showdown value? Maybe a little bit. I would not say this is definitively a no. This is kind of in the middle. Jack high actually, or queen high actually does win here sometimes. Your opponent could have jack 8. They could have random 5-3 of diamonds, right? They could have all sorts of nonsense. You actually do beat some tiny portion of the time. This would be yes. I'm sorry, this would be a very definitive no if you had like ace 5 of diamonds, right? Like ace 5 of diamonds can definitely win at the showdown. But queen jack, it's kind of in the middle. Next, do you have many value hands in your range? Not really. I mean, you got to think a low showdown value draw like 8-7 would probably keep betting the turn. We could have some 10s that would value bet here. But we don't have a ton of value hands, right? So that's a no. Are your blockers highly relevant? No. Here you want to block the straights. So you want to have an 8 or a 7. You also want to have perhaps cards that block your opponent's likely top pair or 9s. Probably have a lot of tight pairs. So I don't think the queen and jack matter all that much. Do you unblock your opponent's auto folds? Auto folds will be king, queen, jack, king, jack, jack 8. Notice we block those to death, which is bad. Does my bluff tell a credible story? Not really. So this is a spot where you do not want to bluff very often at all. LD says the logical thing of the big blind bluffs with 5-3 and jack 8. Therefore, they don't have them in their range. I disagree. A lot of calling stations call too often. That's what they do wrong. That is their big mistake. They call too often. They do not bet too often. They do not bluff too often. They call too often, and then they just lose at the showdown. Now, of course, some people will have a hand like 5-3 and logically decide to bluff the river. A lot of people, though, they'll be like, oh, can't win. I guess I got to check. Check and lose, which is obviously a horrible play. But remember, your opponent's horrible already because they're a calling station. So you can't say that I would bluff in this spot, therefore my opponent will bluff in this spot, right? So this is a scenario where I would not be shocked if your opponent rolls over the jack 8. A lot of people do. It's not good, but a lot of people do. Okay? Now, of course, as your opponent gets better and better, they're going to have fewer and fewer of those hands in their range. But remember, we already have a tendency on our opponent that they do something a little bit wrong. Is this for cash games or tournaments or both? Both! No limit hold'em cash games and no limit hold'em tournaments are not all that different, especially in the early stages of a tournament, because then you're playing roughly the same stack depth as in cash games, and there's relatively few payout implications. A lot of people get it in their heads and they go, this is for tournaments, therefore it's useless to me. Or this is for cash games, therefore it's useless to me. No, not true. Unless you're talking about payout implication scenarios, that's probably not so relevant for cash games. But if you're talking about regular old deep stack poker, which is what we're talking about here, then it definitely applies. And right here, we're talking about a small pot. So this even applies when you're like 30 big blinds deep. Okay, so this is a spot where you probably don't want to bluff. You may never want to bluff. If we had like king high or ace high, I would definitely not bluff. Queen high or jack high or total airball, 7 high, whatever. Those become hands you should be more inclined to bluff. Because then they have like literally no showdown value. Like this becomes more of a slam dunk yes. And we do have a few hands that want to bet for value. But that said, against a calling station, we probably don't want to be bluffing all that often to begin with. Let's take a look at another spot. You raise 3 big blinds pre-flop from the button with queen jack of diamonds. Get a call from the big blind who's playing tightly. You see bet a third pot. Opponent calls. Turn goes check, check. On the river, they check. King, 6, 3, king, 2. We have the queen jack high. Man, oh man, these adult dating sites. They think that you're their prime target market, I guess. Got to block these people. All right. Let's go through the flow chart, figure out what's going on here. All right. Is our opponent capable of folding? Yeah. Tight opponent. Now, to be fair, tight opponent means maybe they have a good hand to begin with and they're not folding. Or it may mean they're just kind of weak and they fold too often. So that read is not a particularly great one. But are they capable of folding? Probably. Do you lack showdown value with the queen jack here? Probably. This is another one that's kind of in the middle because we do beat flush draws, right? And this is another type of player who may not necessarily bluff with flush draws. So it's in the middle. Next, do you have many value hands in our range? Well, definitely. I think we could definitely value bet like a 6 or better here, right? So we have a lot of value hands in this scenario. Are your blockers highly relevant? Not especially. I don't know if there are any relevant blockers here. I mean, your opponent could have the 5-4, but you're not so worried about that. So I don't think there's all that many relevant blockers to begin with. If anything, queen jack blocks king, queen, and queen jack, although they probably bet those on the river. Next, you unblock your opponent's auto folds. Yes, notice here we have no flush draws. Or we block no flush draws. We block backdoor flush draw, but we don't block the hearts. This is a spot where you really don't want to have hearts in your range to bluff, but in this scenario, I still might bluff them anyway. Next, does my bluff tell a credible story? Sure, if I had pocket queens, I'd bet the flop, check, check, turn, bet river, right? And that's going to be a large chunk of my range, down to like queen six suited or something, maybe even wider. So this is a pretty decent spot to bluff. Okay, so now we have to figure out how much we should bluff. Can I explain what blockers are? Blockers are cards that make it to where your opponent cannot have really good hands. So what are really good hands on this board? Well, 5-4 is normally a pretty good hand for a straight. So having a 5 or a 4 in your hand makes it more difficult for your opponent to have the nuts. So if we have a 4 in our hand, now instead of there being 16 combinations of 5-4, there's now only 12 combinations of 5-4. I discussed this at in my fundamentals course. It's completely free. Check it out at pokercoaching.com/fundamentals. Okay, so now, do you have stone zero showdown value? Not really. We certainly have worse hands in our range, like jack high, 10 high, 9 high. So I guess no. This is maybe a yes. This is in the middle. Does my opponent have many marginal made hands? I think the opponent's got a lot of ace high type stuff. I think this is a spot where opponents have a lot of ace high type stuff. Maybe they'll have a lot of like small pairs, like 5s and 4s themselves. Do you block many nut hands? I don't know. Probably not, especially given the opponent's going to bet a lot of their kings, but that's not so relevant. Are you trying to get your opponent off of a strong hand? Like what? Like pocket 7s? No, definitely not. Are you representing a nutted hand? No, definitely not. So notice almost all of these are very clearly leaning towards no, right? So therefore, this is a spot where we probably want to bet small. Notice we're not representing a nut hand because we would have bet the turn with 5-4, and we would have bet the turn with a king, right? Therefore, when we bet the river, we're representing mostly thinnish value hands. So this is a spot where we're going to be betting roughly half pot with a lot of our range that is something like I said, a 6 or better. You may say, is a 6 too wide for value? Probably not. All right. Let's discuss the spectrum of bluffing aggression. The river is notoriously under-bluffed by most players. And that's because most players are at least somewhat afraid to put in money on the river, knowing that if they get called, they lose every time. They're also chicken to show a bluff. In my mind, you should be proud of your bluffs. Don't be embarrassed that you played well. Don't be embarrassed that you tried to take that pot from your opponent. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Also, most players are at least somewhat afraid to overbet the pot when they do bluff the river. Most players in most games, unless you're starting to talk about high-stakes games where people are good and balanced, but in most games, most players, when they bet big on the river, they have the nuts. When they check raise the river, they always have the nuts. You've watched my content at youtube.com/pokercoaching. I know most of you are there right now. If you look at all these hands we've reviewed from poker video bloggers who let us use their content and share them with all of you, when they get check raised on the river, their opponent has the nuts almost every time. Okay? Most people don't want to put in a lot of money without the nuts on the river. So what does that mean for you? Well, you should exploitatively overfold to aggression on the river. Most people don't bluff the river enough, therefore, when they bet, they're more likely to be value heavy. If they're value heavy, you in turn should be more likely to fold your bluff catchers on the river. These are hands that lose to value bets and beat bluffs. You don't want to go around calling with ace high and bottom pair and whatnot against most players unless it's very clear they are loose, aggressive, and battly. And realizing that you and me and everybody else probably falls into this category of people who don't bluff quite enough. Even I don't bluff quite enough. Most people don't bluff quite enough. Maybe I overbluff, to be fair. But most people don't bluff enough. So you need to make sure you are learning to bluff the river in a more balanced way. And if you go through my cash game and tournament masterclasses at pokercoaching.com, we go through lots and lots and lots and lots of examples to show very clearly when you need to be bluffing. Maybe we'll go through one example real quick as soon as we're done here. So, understand that most people have no balance or they're unbalanced on the river to the point that they severely under-bluff the river. Okay? So, realize this, recognize this, understand that your opponents will rarely bluff often enough in real life, and therefore you should adjust and overfold. Okay? We want to talk about positional differences. We're running out of time today. We're not going to discuss positional differences, but there are some. We already alluded to a lot of them. Let's go through an out of position spot on the river. Okay. Is your red line positive, negative, or about 0? It depends on the games you're playing and how you extract your edge. Typically in small stakes games, your red line is going to be negative or low. In high stakes games, your red line is going to be higher or positive. All right, let's take a look at this scenario. We raise the button, big blind calls, flop comes 9, 7, 5. It goes check, check, as it often should do on this board. Turn, big blind overbets on the 2 of hearts board. You may say, what? Is that normal and good? Turns out, yes. This is a board where it's pretty unlikely. Button has the nuts. Big blind could have the nuts. Also, the board's going to change a lot on a lot of rivers. Notice all these middle cards will change the board a lot. The board's very dynamic. We'll be discussing this in my advanced tournament course coming out very soon on pokercoaching.com. And so this is a spot where turn, big blind is going to be betting big a lot of the time. Button calls. All right, let's take a look at out of positions equity on the river. On various rivers, this is how much equity the out of position player, the big blind, will have. Notice the best cards for the big blind are going to be the 6 and the 8, because the 6 and the 8 connect with a lot of the straight draws that will definitely be betting big on the turn. Notice the 9, the 7, and the 5 are actually particularly bad. Why? Because quite often you're not going to be overbetting the turn with a 7 or a 5, right? Especially, and also a 9. I would presume you may overbet with a 9 sometimes, but you're definitely not going to be overbetting with a 7 or a 5. And the button's going to check back the flop with a lot of 7s and 5s and not fold the turn if they're good. You may say, you wouldn't fold to an overbet on the turn? Well, not if you're playing well. So those are particularly bad. Overcards are roughly 50-50. Undercards are close enough to 50-50. So this is a spot where on these particular rivers, you're going to have very different strategies from like a 9 to an 8 or an 8 to a 7. Let's take a look at the size GTO is using when it does bet. Notice that on the 6 and the 8, when GTO bets, it's usually using relatively small or medium bets. Whereas on the 9 in particular, it's not betting all that often. I guess it is betting half the time. Whenever it does bet, it's usually in very big bets, like pot or over pot. Okay? So on the 9, when we do bet, we're betting with a lot of 9s and straights for the nuts and full houses and whatnot. And then we're also betting with a bunch of air balls, right? And we have a large chunk of those. So let's take a look at how we're going to play on an 8 river. So somebody asked earlier, how do we play on ranges? Micah, I think, asked this. What is King 5 suited? Well, King 5 suited is not even in this range because we would have played it differently to get to this point in the hand. So remember, this is a spot where big button raises, we call big blind, flop goes check, check on 9-7-5. Turn is a 2. We overbet pot. Opponent calls. River's an 8. All right. The hands in red are mostly betting either 25% pot or 60% pots. Because in this scenario, we have a pretty strong range. You may be surprised to see a hand like a 9 can actually value bet this river. But notice the 9s are using the lightest colored red here. And those are going to be the 25% pot bets. Remember we said the small bets are usually reserved for your thin value hands, okay? And your larger bets are usually reserved for your better hands. So what are our better hands? Well, it looks like ace 9 and better start to bet a little bit bigger here. We also have straights for 8-6 betting pretty big. We have some 6s. All these 6s on the end are betting pretty big. We have 4-3 for an air ball. Total nothing betting pretty big. We have a lot of these 6s betting pretty big. Okay? Then we have a lot of checks from the 8s. The 8s are now very clearly marginal made hands, so those hands are opting to check. Notice how GTO structures these two most likely bet sizes. When you bet 60% pot, you have straights, sets, and good top pairs, and nothing. So relatively polarized. Not perfectly polarized, but relatively polarized. Notice the 25% pot size has a few nuts, a lot of thin value hands, and then small bets. Was ace 9 overbetting? No, ace 9 was betting 60% pot. I know it's kind of hard to tell here. The straights are the hands that are overbetting. 6-4, 6-3, king 6, queen 6, and 4-3 suited for nothing. This ace 9 is betting the 60% pot size. As we can see with this chart here, we see the 60% pot size is some top pairs. Not a lot of them, some. Kind of hard to see. I realize. I apologize for that. So anyway, the 25% pot size mostly are thin value hands, plus a few bluffs, plus a few nuts. Remember I said your small bet size always need to have some nuts in them. Let's take a look at the 9. The 9 is the spot where, you know, you have some 9s, but you also have a whole lot of nothing on this river, right? So you don't get to bet all that often anymore. But we do have some super nuts, right? Notice we have 8-6, and we have 9s. These are all super duper strong. So take a look at this. Now we're going all in, which would be a gigantic bet. I don't even know how big this would be. This would be a big bet size. Somebody do the math in the chat. 100 big blinds deep. That's pretty deep stacked. This is like a lot of chips. We're ripping in a lot of chips with a lot of our 9s and better, and then a lot of random overcards like Queen Jack, King 10, Jack 10, and that looks to be about it. So we're ripping in 9s and better. So full houses, straights, and that's it. Plus a few sporadic overcard airballs. Then we're overpotting at 120% pot, also with a relatively similar range, right? We do have a few small bets, but you can kind of ignore those for all practical purposes. And then we're checking a lot of marginal hands. Marginal hands on this board are going to be just a lot of give-ups. Notice we do have a lot of give-ups in this scenario, plus a lot of 7s if we have them. So notice we have like some 7-5. We don't actually have a lot of 7s. We have ace highs. Pretty bad range if you look at it, right? So essentially we're checking a lot of ace highs. We don't get to bluff with all of our bluffs in this spot, because if we bluffed with all of our bluffs, then we would have far too many bluffs. And why would we rather bet Queen Jack than Queen 6? That's the question we need to ask, right? Remember I said we have to go through that flowchart and figure it out. In this scenario, it's very unlikely the opponent has a straight, right? So we don't really care about the 6 blocker all that much, I don't think, because they probably don't have a straight, because they probably would have check raised it on the... Oh, wait. Slow. We're the one out of position here. I'm getting confused, getting sidetracked. Reading all the chat over here. So we're out of position. I would naturally think we probably want to bet the Queen 6 here a lot, but I guess not. I guess we'd rather do the Queen Jack. I guess because Queen Jack blocks overpairs a little bit better. And Queen Jack blocks Queen 9 and Jack 9 a little bit better, right? Whereas the 6 does not block 9-6 so much, because the opponent doesn't have all the 9-6s in their range. So here, I think the most relevant hands we want to block are actually queens, jacks, 10s, Queen 9, Jack 9, etc., which is why we're going to use these hands, these overcards for bluff. So the kickers to the 9s that make a lot of sense are the most likely hands to use for the big bet. So let's take a look at the all-in range here. All-in range here is going to be very polarized. Full house, straight, and trips. Nuts, nuts, and nuts. And then some bluffs. Okay? Checking range is going to be a little bit of nuts, a little bit of trips, a bunch of ace high, some king high, and some airball. This is a spot where we just do not get to get after it all that often. What do the gray hands mean? The gray hands mean they are not in your range at this point. The light gray hands going down the middle are just pairs. That's just a way to make the chart a little bit easier to look at. If it was all dark gray, it'd be a little bit more muddled. So all these hands in gray are hands that would have played differently at some point. Now, obviously, you see like King 10 here. King 10 suited is played differently almost every time up until this point, but you have a little bit of it. So either they were folded or they were played differently. Like aces, for example. You raise aces pre-flop, and I suppose you would have bet it. I'm sorry, you would have 3-bet aces pre-flop every time, because remember, they raise button, we're in the big blind, we would have 3-bet aces every time. Therefore, we have 0 aces in our range. Queen 6 also blocks some folding stuff, such as pair plus gutter. Yeah, you're right. Or just like ace 6, right? Ace 6 and ace 8 are hands that would check back the flop. So if you have a Queen 6, you block their ace 6, which means they're less likely to have the ace 6. Makes sense? Let's go through one more spot. Why not? Then you all can head over to pokercoaching.com and go to the poker coaching study session ran by Louis Philippe. They've been crushing it recently at poker. So make sure you check out that at pokercoaching.com. You can get into the study sessions in the community tab on pokercoaching.com. All right, big blind versus low jack. Low jack opens, we call big blind, king, king, 6. We check, they bet small, we call, turn goes check, check. Every river is good for us besides an ace, because in this scenario, when they go check, check, they have a lot of ace high, and they have a lot of nonsense. We will have some kings, we'll have some pairs, right, under pairs. We have a lot of kings and a lot of under pairs. We'll have a lot of 6s too, okay? So notice all these cards are good for us because if they do have a random unpaired hand, sometimes they hit, but a lot of the time they miss, right? So in this scenario, we have a situation where from out of position, we don't get to use large bets all that often because we will be betting into the opponent's nuts some portion of the time. Okay? We are betting into their nuts some portion of the time. So we can't just blast it, right? Therefore, when we do bet, we're usually betting using a small-ish or medium-ish size. So in this spot, notice on the ace river, the ace river is actually particularly bad for us, right? So when the river's particularly bad, because they're going to have a lot of ace X, when we bet, we want to be very polarized. This is the one exception. Notice on the ace river, our equity is very low, but we still have a lot of trips that want to bet. So when we do bet the the ace river, we're going to be betting it mostly with our kings, right? We're blasting it with our kings, and that's mainly it. So in this spot, we are checking all of our underpairs, blasting with all of our kings, and then finding some bluffs. Bluffs are going to, I suppose, want to block full houses. So notice we are betting with some 9-6, 8-6, 7-6, 6-5. Seems kind of weird. We're betting with underpairs. You may ask, why are we betting with 5s, 4s, and 3s here? And that's just because we don't have any other bluffs. I mean, look at our range to get to this point, right? So in this scenario, to get to this point, we just don't have much garbage. So when we don't have much garbage, we have to look a little bit hard to find our garbage. Notice we are already bluffing with Queen Jack, Queen 10, Queen 9, and Jack 10 a large chunk of the time. So this is a spot where when we bet, we're going to be betting mostly big, but we're not going to be betting all that often. So a lot of our trips and a lot of our nothing. So notice we have 120% pot size with mainly trips and nothing. And our checking range is going to be a lot of, well, some super nuts still, some trips and full houses. Then a lot of the top pairs for ace X, a lot of third pair, which is like under pairs, and sixes, and low pairs, and then nothing. So lots of marginal hands are checking. Lots of nuts and junk are betting. Very common scenario out of position here. Let's look at a 2 river. On the 2 river, now we actually have a lot of hands that can value bet. Notice now our under pairs, 7s and better, can now bet for value, as well as all of our kings, right? So all those get to bet for value. 6s probably don't. That's close. We don't have very many 2s, neither does the opponent. And now we got to find some bluffs. So what are bluffs on this board? Well, again, Queen Jack, Queen 10, Jack, Queen 9, Jack 10. These are all bluffs. But we don't actually have all that many of them, so we need to find additional bluffs. Our additional bluffs want to block the opponent's auto calls. Auto calls are going to be stuff like, I don't even know. Kickers to the king. Maybe the ace, so that makes the ace queen and the ace jack okay, I guess. I mean, I don't know. This is a spot where I think we're just looking hard to find as many bluffs as we can, because we don't have all that many, logically. Now, we could perhaps even bet slightly wider for value. Notice some kings check, but you want to make sure you're checking some kings to protect your checking range, because you still have 5s, 4s, 3s, random 6s, etc., etc. So see in this spot, on the river, when we bet, we're usually betting small with mostly some nuts, some marginal made hands, some garbage, and when we bet really small, same story, right? Still, like, but slightly more weaker hands in this scenario. And we are betting even stuff like ace high with almost no nothing. The thing is the ace high is like, again, this is a weird spot because we don't actually have all that many logical bluffs. So it's almost like these ace high are bluffs, but they're sometimes good, right? So anyway, this is my tournament. This is part of my cash game masterclass. We have a lot of these slides. We go through a bunch of spots, in position, out of position, etc., etc. We show how very equities line up. In the advanced tournament course coming out soon, we got to go through a lot of spots like this to show how you actually go about structuring your ranges in various spots. I know this chart may be new to a lot of people, but this chart basically shows the bottom portion of the out of positions equity is quite good, and the top portion is quite good, right? This is a spot where I was going to say this is probably the Jack 6-6 board, right? On Jack 6-6, the out of position player has a whole lot of 6s, which is why they have this spike in equity right up at the top of the range, which means that whenever the low jack is betting this scenario, they're probably not getting to bet all that big, right? And you can kind of look at a lot of these charts like this and start to realize how your equities will line up and whatnot. So anyway, we have a whole section on river exploits, etc., 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 etc. Do these situations really apply? Well, have you ever played a hand where someone raises and you call in the big blind and it goes check, check on the flop, and then you bet the turn and they call, and then you got to figure out what to do? Does that actually apply? Of course it applies. You must learn to play good, strong, fundamentally sound poker so that you know how to play against players who you don't know what they do wrong, and also so that you know where to adjust from to take advantage of whatever your opponents do incorrectly. I mean, like I said, we have a whole section here on river exploits. Then, of course, we have a section on calling, river bets, etc., etc., etc. So check this out at pokercoaching.com. Also, now that you hopefully know how to bluff a little bit better, check it out at pokercoaching.com/bluffing quiz. That's me for today. Good luck. Have fun. Make the most of your week. It's Monday. We have a lot of time and a lot of good things to do. Get out there, benefit the world. Don't get dragged down by the nonsense that people will inevitably spew at you. And I hope you make the most of your opportunities. If you enjoyed the show, click the like and subscribe button. I would appreciate that. Also, head over to pokercoaching.com right now. Click in the community tab, get in the Discord, and hop in the poker coaching study sessions. I'll talk to you all next time. Bye-bye.